Hey everyone, good to see you again. I am still on paternity leave. Most of you probably don't know that, but if you caught the little talk that I put up a couple of months ago, you'll know that I was about to be on paternity leave. It's happening. Life is wonderful, but that also means that while I am excited to be back doing some of this work again, back on my YouTube channel, talking about locks and whatnot, it also means that I just don't have time yet to actually produce the sort of content that I think y'all probably subscribed for to begin with. So, I have a whole bunch of folks just waiting for me to put things out, and there's already some exceptional content out there that doesn't have nearly enough attention on it. So I wanted to tell you about some creators that I really love. I'll probably do a couple of these because I've been meeting a lot of people, I've been seeing what's going on currently in the locksport world, and there's some incredible stuff out there. But first is my absolute favorite. This is Artichoke. He puts up videos in a very similar style to how I used to way back when, only he has taken it to a much higher level. He's incredible at explaining how locks work, how very unique locks work. He's incredible at getting into the history of them as well, to really understand where they came from, to contextualize them, and he's just a hell of a nice guy too. I'm a big fan. I'm going to show you some clips of 3 of his videos right here. The first one is just a really clever concept. He goes through the incredible history of a large number of manufacturers of low security, just normal pin tumbler locks, while also picking them. So he's a high security picker, incredible high security picker, but he just knocks through a couple dozen lower security locks. But in the process of doing that, he talks in depth about how all of them came to be, about their founders, their creators, and it's just this great way to get a beautiful encapsulation of sort of the history of the manufacturing that leads to this love of locksport as well. So I'm going to show you a little clip of that one, and obviously we'll link to the whole thing, and then I'll show you a little more. He's got a couple others that I want to highlight before you go wandering off to his channel and watch his entire back catalog.
Oh, hey there. I'm Artichoke, and I'm a high-security lockpicker. Today, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to be picking through the most commonly found residential locks found throughout the United States. Chances are that if you live in the US, you own one of these locks. We're going to see how they hold up to high-skilled picking attacks as I tell you a little bit about them. Let's take a look at Schlage. Walter Schlage was perhaps ahead of his time with his first patent in 1909, which was for a door lock that would turn on the lights in the room when opened. What really launched his company was in 1923, his patent for the bored cylindrical lock, which was an enormous commercial success. Prior to this design, door locks were mostly of the mortise variety. Schlage also patented and popularized the push-button doorknob in 1924, which to this day is commonly found in many residential bathroom doors. Let's take a look at how the Schlage SC1 keyway holds up to a picking attack. Severin Feyerman was born in 1922 in Będzin, Poland. His family's hardware business was confiscated by the Nazis. Mr. Feyerman survived the horrors of the Auschwitz concentration camp and immigrated to the U.S. with his family in 1946. Together, they purchased a small tool shop named Baldwin Tool & Die and quickly expanded into the manufacturing of luxury hardware. Today, Baldwin is owned by Spectrum Brands and are sister companies with Kwikset. Curiously, they implement the Schlage SC1 keyway.
See what I'm saying? It's fantastic. So next up, I was largely unaware of how remarkable this particular cylinder is. And I pride myself on knowing about every weird, interesting lock that's come along, but this kind of hits this soft spot in my own knowledge, this time period that I am not as well versed in. And while I knew about the Segal Pick-Proof cylinder, I had no idea of how extraordinary a lock this was, or why it was so rare to begin with. Makes me feel pretty frustrated that I actually gave one up in my early lockpicking career before I really had any idea what I had in front of me. But in this video, not only does he go into the history of this, and in fact some of the legal history of this lock, why it's no longer produced, but he also does an incredible breakdown of exactly how it functions, and this really remarkable theory of picking what are called these gin, these counter-milled security pins. So here's a little bit from that, and I'll bring you back for one more.
The Segal Pick-Proof is the most incredible pin tumbler lock that you have likely never heard of, with an equally fascinating history. It was initially patented in 1937 by Samuel Segal, a retired police officer who was best known for the Segal Jimmy-proof deadbolt. Mr. Segal was so confident that his lock was impossible to pick that he inscribed the words Pickproof on the face of the lock and widely advertised that his lock was indeed pick-proof. A complaint was issued to the Federal Trade Commission in 1939, and Samuel Segal was taken to court. The court took the definition of pick-proof as being any non-destructive form of opening the lock, and 3 locksmiths had testified that they had previously picked this lock. To prove that the lock was not pick-proof, the Segal Pick-Proof lock was installed on the door of the hearing room. Only the examiner and the locksmiths were inside the room as to protect their trade secrets. After 30 minutes, the door was picked and unlocked. Samuel Segal lost the case and stopped manufacturing one of the most pick-resistant locks ever produced. Today, after 80 years, we'll see what it takes to pick open that Segal Pick-Proof. Let's take a closer look at this lock. The Segal Pick-Proof is a 5-pin tumbler lock with gin security drivers. Locks with gin drivers typically have countermilling in the plug of the lock. Countermilling is the widening of the pin chamber below the shear line so that it matches the shape of the driver pin. This is what gives the gin spool driver its unique picking characteristics, as it will directly interact with and get locked into the plug. Some locks, like the Ruco 500, use a stationary sleeve around the plug of the lock, which acts as countermilling. This is accomplished by milling off the top of the plug above the pin chambers and then encasing the plug with a sleeve. This gives the lock similar functionality to direct countermilling. The Segal Pick-Proof takes the sleeve concept one step further. The Pick-Proof takes the sleeve and cuts it in half. The bottom half of the sleeve is fixed to the plug. The top half sits on top of the plug and is mobile. It can move side to side. The space between the plug and the mobile sleeve acts like countermilling, and for simplicity will be referred to as pseudo-countermilling. This is the plug of the Segal Pick-Proof with its fixed lower sleeve, and this is the mobile sleeve, which, when placed atop the plug, moves side to side. Now that we have the basic anatomy down, let's see what it takes to pick this lock. In order to understand how the mobile sleeve functions, we should first review how standard gin locks are picked. The first step in picking gin spools is to get all the gin drivers into the countermilling. This allows the lock to enter a deep false set. Next, each gin head in turn is picked above the shear line by a process known as float picking. Float picking is using fine control over manual counter rotation to unlock the head of the gin from the countermilling and lifting it above the shear line. Between each pin, you can re-enter a false set, and in some locks, a deeper false set will favor dropping less pins. If you attempt to pick the Segal Pick-Proof in this manner, it will not work. Let's take a look at what happens. The gin driver is initially picked into the pseudo countermilling, and a deep false set is entered when the plug is maximally rotated in the counterclockwise direction. This action causes the sleeve to be maximally rotated to the right, as you can see at this point here, in which it abuts the lower stationary sleeve. In order to unlock the gin heads from the pseudo countermilling, you must then rotate the plug in the clockwise direction. The initial rotation will cause the plug to move without the sleeve. At this point, the gin head is still fully locked into the pseudo countermilling. The problem now is that the sleeve has the ability to move in this direction, so that any attempt to lift the gin driver past the sleeve will cause it to move to the right and drop any of the set pins. So how do you pick the Pickproof? Let's take a look at this in more detail. By minimizing the rotation into the false set, you can effectively immobilize the sleeve. How does this work? Using very controlled tension in the counterclockwise direction, the gin is lifted so that it just rests above the plug and the shallowest of false sets is obtained. Now the sleeve is maximally rotated and abutting this point as before. With minimal clockwise rotation and upward pressure on the pin may be set above the shear line without disturbing the relative position of the sleeve. The sleeve is always maximally rotated and in essence immobilized. This greatly reduces the dropping of set pins, but in no way eliminates it. The drawback of this method is that the feedback of a set pin and an unset pin is very difficult to differentiate. The best way that I have found to reliably set the gin is to feel how high they are set in the countermilling, and then, by experience, know how high they must be set so that they clear the shear line. Once you are convinced that all the driver pins are resting above the shear line, you can attempt to open the lock. The problem is that if you are incorrect and rotate the plug with even one pin that is not above the shear line, the gin gets locked into the mobile sleeve and you have to reset the whole lock and start from the beginning.
Right? Yeah, the Pickproof has just made it right back onto my list of locks that I need to track down again someday. Again, feel really, really frustrated that when I was new and had no idea what I was doing, I gave one of those right away, thinking that it was a piece of junk. But finally, he is a high-security lock picker. And while, yes, that was an incredibly high-security lock, or an interestingly high-security lock, and you'd have to watch the whole thing to really see him go into all of it. I also want to show you him pulling apart picking and explaining the theory for picking a brand new lock before it had actually hit the market. As far as I know, he was the first to publicly pick the Medeco M4, and he picked it before it was available for sale. So here's a little snippet of that, of him again explaining the concept of the picking. And again, it's another one you got to watch in full. Check out his entire catalog. I'm so pleased to know this guy, and I just know that you're going to love his content. And yeah, it seems silly to have tens of thousands of you sitting around here waiting for me to put something out when there are people like Artichoke out there who really deserve your attention and who's just doing absolutely remarkable work. All right, enjoy the last clip and check the details for links to more of his videos and of course his main channel. All right, I'll catch y'all later on. I'm going to go hang out with the kiddos. Life is really good, but I'll catch back up with all of you soon. Bye.
The M4 was introduced in 2021. It has the same biaxial key pins and drivers as the M3. The plug is countermilled to interact with the barrel drivers. New to this model are 4 sprung sliders, which must be lifted to the correct height so that their true gates align and allow the sidebar to retract into them. Let's take a look at the key pins in more detail. This is a top view of the key pin sitting in a pin chamber in the plug of the lock. On the right is its true gate. On the left, in blue, is the rotation limiter. The rotation limiter is a projection on the top of the key pin, which is restricted in movement by this cutout in the pin chamber. This allows the pin to be rotated 20 degrees in either direction and allows for 3 possible positions of the true gate. The chisel tip on the bottom of the key pin is always in line with the rotation limiter. Here it is superimposed on top of the key pin as the key pin is rotated. In order for any pin to be oriented properly to accept the sidebar projection, its true gate must be pointed to the right. Let's look at each of the 3 rotational key pin types. This is the 0-degree key pin, and its relative chisel tip orientation shown in yellow on the left. The chisel tip on the bottom of the key pin must be rotated to 0 degrees for the true gate of this key pin to be correctly oriented to interact with the sidebar. The 0-degree key pin has one true gate and no false gates. This is the 20-degree key pin. The chisel tip on the bottom of this key pin must be rotated to 20 degrees for the true gate to be correctly oriented. It has one true gate in either 1 or 0 false gates. Finally, this is the minus 20-degree key pin. The chisel tip on the bottom of this key pin must be rotated minus 20 degrees for the true gate to be correctly oriented. It too has one true gate and either 1 or 0 false gates. These are the three rotational position key pin types with their true gates lined up to the right side. As with every model of the Medeco, the M4 sidebar has 6 small projections which interact with the vertical true gate of each key pin. New to this model, the M4 has cylindrical cutouts in the sidebar to accommodate the 4 sliders. In each cutout there is a horizontal bar that interacts with the gates of the sliders. Let's take a closer look at the slider types. There are 4 sprung sliders in the M4 which interact with a key, 3 regular sliders, and 1 interactive slider which is pushed up by this interactive element. According to Medeco's marketing information, there are 3 regular slider types. After analyzing the design, it is theoretically possible to produce a 4th regular slider type, which is shown on the right. Here they are all lined up by their true gates. The interactive slider has a notch cut out of its bottom. It has no false gates. This is where the interactive element of the key pushes up the slider. Let's take a look at how each slider interacts with the sidebar in isolation. In the following demonstration, the slider will be displayed on the right panel, and the specific gate that is being tested will be pointed out by an arrow. It is important to note that when multiple sliders are installed in the lock, a given slider will only behave in the following manner if it is the current slider that is binding. Slider 1 is the minimum lift slider. It needs only be slightly nudged up to catch its true gate. It is possible to overlift this slider, in which case the false gate will engage the sidebar and will become stiff. Slider 2 has its true gate flanked in between 2 false gates. In its neutral position, the first false gate will bind into the sidebar. Slow counter rotation and continuous tapping on the slider will allow the slider to be moved up into its true gate. Once again, if the slider is pushed too high, it will engage with the next false gate and the slider will become stiff. Slider 3 has its false gate first in line and will bind to the sidebar, causing it to become stiff. As with slider 2, slow counter rotation and tapping on the slider will allow the slider to be manipulated into its true gate. The last slider type is the interactive slider. It is essentially the same lift height as slider 2, but has no false gates to deal with. There are 2 ways to lift this slider. The first is by slipping the pick underneath this part of the slider with a lateral motion. The other is by rotating the pick to interact with and lift this ledge of the slider. Alright, let's get to picking. The bitting on this lock is perhaps the most challenging possible, with high lifts in 1, 5, and 6 associated with barrels, and low lifts in the middle of the lock. Position 3 has a mushroom which once picked causes all the set barrels to drop. The pick that I'm using is a Rat Yoke Original. It's modeled after the number 7 Peterson, which is my favorite pick for the Medeco. I'm tensioning in the clockwise direction and getting to the back of the lock. Number 6 is a plus 20 rotation, high lift barrel, and it's a nice click at a 6. It's going to 5. 5 is a minus 20 barrel, high lift. Nice click out of 5. And these are not set all the way, even though they're passing the jiggle test. They're going to bind a little bit later. That's 4, which is a 0 rotation. And that feels set. 3 is the mushroom. Normally, when I lift this up, everything drops. I got really